November 14, 1941. Somewhere in the Libyan interior, 400 miles south of the Via Balbia coastal road, 3 Afrika Korps supply lorries are moving through what German operational maps have classified as impassable terrain. Their drivers believe themselves invisible, untouchable, operating in a void that no Allied force could possibly reach or sustain. The route has been chosen precisely because it runs through the Great Sand Sea, a region of towering dune systems and murderous heat that German logistics planners had deemed a natural barrier against interdiction. There are no Allied forces within 400 miles. The convoy commander has not even posted sentries. He is, by every reasonable military calculation, perfectly safe. Then the desert explodes. From positions concealed behind a dune ridge the convoy did not know existed, Chevrolet 30 CWT trucks opened fire with mounted Vickers K machine guns, Lewis guns, and a 37mm Bofors cannon. The attack lasts less than 4 minutes. When it ends, all 3 lorries are burning, their cargo of aviation fuel destroyed, their crews dead or captured, and their attackers have already melted back into the terrain that was supposed to make them impossible. By the time a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft reaches the area 3 hours later, there is nothing to find but charred metal and tire tracks leading south into the Great Sand Sea. The long-range desert group has struck again. And vanished. And the Afrika Korps has lost another column in terrain that was supposed to be safe. American liaison officers attached to 8th Army headquarters in Cairo were, by late 1941, beginning to ask questions about these operations that the British found difficult to answer concisely. The Americans had a straightforward military doctrine: find the enemy, mass forces against him, advance. The long-range desert group did not do any of those things. It operated in penny packets of rarely more than 2 or 3 patrols, each numbering perhaps 20 to 30 men in a handful of modified trucks. It did not hold ground. It did not seek decisive engagement. It operated at distances from any supply base that American logistical doctrine declared impossible without establishing forward depots, and it achieved this impossible sustainability through methods that defied conventional military accounting. The Americans understood armored thrusts. They understood air superiority campaigns. What they were watching at 8th Army was something else entirely. And what they struggled to grasp was that the Afrika Korps feared these tiny, vanishing patrols in ways it never quite feared the American armored columns that would eventually arrive in Tunisia. The reasons for that fear reach back to a single eccentric British officer and a pre-war desert journey that should not have been possible. Ralph Alger Bagnold was not a conventional soldier. A Royal Signals officer who spent much of the interwar period conducting privately funded explorations of the Libyan desert, he developed between 1926 and 1938 a body of practical knowledge about extreme desert movement that no other military officer on Earth possessed in comparable depth. Bagnold understood the Great Sand Sea not as an obstacle but as terrain with rules, and he spent years learning those rules through direct experimentation. He understood dune formation and navigation. He understood how to cross soft sand without bogging down through the use of sand channels and controlled tire deflation. He understood sun compasses, celestial navigation, and the precise daily water requirements of men operating in 50-degree heat. He understood how to carry enough petrol to move 1,500 miles from a base without resupply, not through brute logistics but through radical vehicle modification, load discipline, and the elimination of every kilogram of weight that was not strictly essential to survival and combat. When war came in June 1940 and Italy entered on Germany's side, Bagnold was in Cairo on entirely unrelated duties. He went directly to General Wavell with a proposal that the British military establishment would, in ordinary circumstances, have filed and forgotten. Bagnold wanted to form a unit that would operate deep in the Libyan interior, thousands of kilometers behind Italian lines, attacking supply routes that the Italians believed were protected by the desert itself. He had one critical insight that made this possible where no conventional force could follow. The Italians, and later the Germans, did not patrol their deep desert flanks. They could not. They lacked the navigational expertise, the vehicle modifications, and the accumulated practical knowledge to operate there sustainably. Bagnall had spent 12 years acquiring precisely that knowledge. He was proposing to exploit a gap in the enemy's situational awareness so profound that entire supply routes could be attacked repeatedly, and the attackers could simply disappear. Wavell, a man with enough imagination to recognize a genuine strategic opportunity, said yes. He gave Bagnall 6 weeks to form and equip his unit. The Long-Range Desert Group came into existence in July 1940 with equipment that was, in many respects, improvised. Bagnall requisitioned Chevrolet 30 CWT commercial trucks from Egyptian civilians, stripped them of every unnecessary fitting, fitted them with condensers to recover radiator water, added sun compasses of his own design, and mounted combinations of machine guns and light cannon. The navigation system was crucial. The British Army's standard magnetic compass was unreliable in a vehicle full of metal, and Bagnall had developed a sun compass during his pre-war explorations that used a shadow disc and a clock mechanism to provide accurate bearings regardless of magnetic interference. Paired with dead reckoning, celestial observation, and the intimate knowledge of terrain features that came from Bagnall's years of exploration, the system allowed LRDG patrols to navigate with precision across hundreds of miles of featureless terrain that Italian and German forces could not safely enter at all. The advantage was total and asymmetric. The LRDG could go where the enemy could not follow, strike at targets the enemy believed were unreachable, and vanish back into terrain that provided perfect concealment precisely because the enemy had no capacity to operate within it. The first operational patrols in September 1940 demonstrated immediately that the concept was not merely sound but devastating, in effect disproportionate to the forces involved. A single patrol under Captain Pat Clayton struck the Italian garrison at Merzig in the Deep Fezzan, destroyed aircraft on the ground, killed the garrison commander, and withdrew successfully across 1,500 miles of desert. The entire operation was conducted with fewer than 80 men. Italian headquarters in Tripoli spent 3 days trying to determine what force had attacked Merzig before concluding that it must have been an air raid. The possibility that motor vehicles had crossed the Great Sand Sea from Egypt was not seriously considered. It was, by conventional military logic, not possible. The pattern established at Merzig repeated itself throughout 1941 and into 1942 with accumulating effect on German logistics that the Afrika Korps never fully resolved. The critical vulnerability was the supply chain itself. Rommel's operations depended absolutely on a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, and vehicle spare parts through a logistics network that ran from the Mediterranean ports, primarily Tripoli and Benghazi, southward and eastward along the Via Balbia and its inland feeder routes. The coastal road was heavily used and relatively well protected, but the inland supply dumps, fuel depots, and route sectors away from the coast were defended only by the assumption that the terrain made attack impossible. The LRDG destroyed that assumption systematically. On January 23, 1941, a patrol under Lieutenant Ballantyne attacked the Italian airfield at Agila, destroying 4 aircraft on the ground and killing 19 ground personnel before withdrawing. The attack was conducted at night, the patrol having navigated 600 miles from its forward operating base at Kufra. On March 4, 1941, another patrol intercepted a German fuel convoy on an inland route 340 miles south of the Via Balbia, destroying 7 lorries carrying 15,000 gallons of aviation petrol that Rommel's air support units had been waiting for. On September 17, 1941, a patrol raided the Axis airfield at Bars, destroying or damaging 35 aircraft in a single strike operation conducted in conjunction with a special air service team transported to the target by LRDG vehicles. On October 26, 1941, a patrol attacked a German supply depot at Han, destroying approximately 200 tons of ammunition and 8,000 gallons of fuel and withdrawing before the garrison's defensive reaction could be organized. The garrison outnumbered the attackers by more than 20 to 1. What made these incidents collectively devastating, beyond the direct material losses, was their effect on German route planning and convoy security. By mid-1941, the Afrika Korps logistics staff was being compelled to route supply convoys away from what should have been the most efficient inland tracks, adding distance and petrol consumption to every supply run precisely because the LRDG had demonstrated that no inland route was genuinely safe. German convoy commanders began requesting escorts for movements in terrain where, 6 months earlier, no escort would have been contemplated. Those escorts consumed fuel themselves. The security measures imposed to guard against desert raiders who might appear from any direction consumed time, manpower, and logistical capacity that Rommel desperately needed elsewhere. General Rommel, a man not given to admitting problems his headquarters could not solve, described the interdiction of his supply lines as the primary constraint on his operational freedom throughout 1941. He did not specify the LRDG by name in most communications, referring instead to British irregular forces, but the operational records are clear about which force was causing the majority of the deep desert disruption. The numbers tell a story that is almost incomprehensible when set against the forces involved. Between July 1940 and December 1942, the Long-Range Desert Group conducted operations with a maximum strength at any given time of approximately 350 men organized into roughly 25 patrol-strength vehicles per operation. Against this force, never exceeding a reinforced company in total strength, the Afrika Korps diverted resources equivalent to several infantry battalions purely for convoy escort and supply route security duties. German intelligence estimated in October 1941 that British desert raiding forces numbered between 3,000 and 5,000 men operating from multiple forward bases. The true figure was closer to 200 men operationally deployed at any given time. The disproportion between actual LRDG strength and German perception of that strength represents perhaps the most efficient force multiplication achieved by any Allied unit in the entire North African campaign. The root cause of this disproportion was not merely the effectiveness of the LRDG's attacks, damaging as those were. It was the navigational and sustainment superiority that made those attacks possible, and that superiority had a specific technical foundation. Bagnall's sun compass was a genuinely superior instrument for desert navigation, but the deeper advantage was institutional knowledge. The LRDG had, concentrated in a tiny unit, more accumulated practical expertise in Libyan desert movement than the entire Italian 10th Army and Afrika Korps combined. German and Italian forces could not send comparable units into the deep desert to hunt the LRDG because they did not know how to navigate, sustain, or recover vehicles in that terrain. They could and did send aircraft, but aircraft over the Great Sand Sea faced the same navigation difficulties as ground forces and had no meaningful ability to detect camouflaged vehicles that had months of experience hiding from aerial observation. The LRDG operated in a sanctuary that the enemy had created for them through ignorance, and that sanctuary only grew more secure as LRDG expertise deepened with operational experience. The vehicle modification program was central to this sanctuary. The standard Chevrolet 30 CWT truck, modified by the LRDG, carried enough fuel and water for operations of up to 14 days without resupply, in temperatures regularly exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. This required stripping the vehicle to its absolute minimum weight, replacing standard tires with sand tires of reduced pressure, fitting condensers to recover water from the radiator, and carrying rations calculated to provide adequate nutrition at the absolute minimum weight. Each truck carried approximately 150 gallons of petrol in jerrycans, 40 gallons of water, and enough food for 12 to 14 men for 2 weeks. The weight discipline was extreme. Personal kit was limited to what a man could carry in a single sandbag. Officers carried the same kit as other ranks. The vehicles were maintained with a thoroughness that reflected the understanding that a broken-down truck 600 miles from base was not a logistical problem, but a death sentence. LRDG fitters could perform engine rebuilds in the field under conditions that would have been considered impossible in any conventional workshop environment. The American forces that arrived in North Africa in November 1942 brought with them logistical methods that were in many respects vastly superior to anything the British could field. American trucks were more numerous, American fuel and supply reserves were larger, and American industrial production could replace losses at a rate that the British could not match. What American forces could not replicate, at least initially, was the accumulated institutional expertise in desert operations that the LRDG represented at its highest development. American armored advances in Tunisia required roads, or at minimum trafficable tracks. They required forward fuel dumps established by conventional logistics chains. They required communications infrastructure and weather conditions that permitted air cover. The LRDG required none of these things, and had demonstrated repeatedly that it could operate effectively in conditions that grounded conventional forces entirely. This distinction matters because it illuminates why Afrika Korps supply personnel feared the LRDG in a way that they never quite feared American armored pressure. An American advance required preparation, assembly, and movement through terrain that was observable and predictable. It could be detected, assessed, and countered, or at least its general direction and timing could be anticipated. The LRDG gave no such warning. A supply convoy moving on a route used safely 50 times could be attacked on the 51st transit by a force that had navigated 700 miles of empty desert to reach that specific point, struck, and was already 200 miles away before the smoke cleared. There was no reliable defense against this because the defense would have required the enemy to patrol terrain they could not operate in, with navigation systems they did not possess, sustained by logistical methods they had not developed. There is, however, an honest complication to this story that any fair account requires. The long-range desert group's operational effectiveness had inherent limits that the organization's own commanders understood clearly. The unit could destroy supplies, but it could not hold territory. It could interdict routes, but it could not permanently close them. It could inflict material losses that were, in aggregate, significant, but it could not achieve the kind of decisive strategic results that conventional forces could produce when conditions were favorable. Bagnall himself was explicit about this. The LRDG was a scalpel, not a sword, and its effectiveness depended entirely on the enemy's continued vulnerability to a form of warfare they could not counter. When German forces began flying supply missions directly to forward dumps, bypassing road convoys entirely, the LRDG's ability to interdict fuel supplies diminished significantly. When improved Axis air search patterns began covering more of the deep desert, the unit's sanctuary contracted. By mid-1942 the LRDG was operating under considerably more constraint than it had enjoyed in 1941, and its casualty rates were rising. The losses were also, when examined closely, higher than the romantic narrative of Desert Ghost Raiders suggests. Between July 1940 and December 1942 the LRDG lost 58 men killed in action and a further 112 wounded, against a unit that never exceeded 350 total strength. These are not trivial numbers. The navigational expertise that made the unit effective also made it irreplaceable in a way that conventional units were not. When an experienced LRDG navigator was killed, his accumulated knowledge of specific desert routes, water sources, and vehicle recovery techniques died with him. The unit was rebuilding that institutional knowledge continuously even as it was expending it, and the training pipeline for genuinely qualified desert operators was measured in months rather than weeks. What validated the LRDG's approach more conclusively than any single operation was the response of other Allied nations to what the unit demonstrated. The Special Air Service, formed in late 1941, used LRDG transport and navigation expertise for its first 18 months of operations because it could not yet independently sustain itself in deep desert. American OSS units observed LRDG methods and incorporated them into planning for operations in other theaters. The vehicle modification techniques that Bagnall had developed from pre-war civilian practice became the foundation of doctrinal guidance for desert vehicle operations that all Allied desert forces eventually adopted. The Sun Compass design was standardized and issued across multiple units. The water recovery condenser system was adopted by long-range penetration units operating in other desert theaters. Bagnall had not merely created a unit. He had created a methodology, and that methodology spread because it worked in circumstances where no other approach was available. General Harold Alexander, commanding 8th Army through the critical period of 1942, later assessed the LRDG's contribution in terms that captured the essential asymmetry. He noted that the unit consumed less than 0.25% of the total logistical support provided to 8th Army, while consistently disrupting a proportion of Axis supply operations that equivalent conventional forces would have required divisional strength to approximate. Admiral of the fleet Andrew Cunningham, whose naval forces were simultaneously attempting to strangle Axis sea supply routes from the north, described the LRDG as his preferred instrument of attrition precisely because it operated without the immense logistical overhead that warships required. The unit that Bagnall had assembled from Egyptian civilian trucks and Royal Signals expertise was achieving effects against Rommel's supply chain that Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet could not always replicate. Ralph Bagnall himself returned to research work before the North African campaign reached its conclusion. He did not lead patrols in the field during the critical 1942 operations. He did not see Rommel's surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, the final validation that the steady attrition of German supply capability, to which the LRDG had contributed a disproportionate share, had done precisely what his 1940 proposal to Wavell had promised. After the war, Bagnall returned to physics and produced work on the fluid dynamics of windblown sand that remains foundational to the field. He had, characteristically, found the scientific principles underlying the terrain features he had spent his military career exploiting. The Afrika Korps convoy drivers who survived the war remember the deep desert supply runs not as encounters with superior armored forces or devastating air attacks, but as long hours of driving through terrain that felt inexplicably malevolent, where every dune ridge might conceal something that had no right to be there. The fear was reasonable. Something was there, and it had been there since 1940, operating in conditions German planners had declared impossible, built from a pre-war British officer's private obsession with the desert that most soldiers rightly regarded as fatal ground. The long-range desert group demonstrated, at minimal cost and with ruthless efficiency, a principle that conventional military thinking consistently undervalues. That the most dangerous weapon in any theater is not the one with the most firepower, but the one that can reach places the enemy believes are safe. Rommel could prepare for an armored advance. He had no answer for men who appeared from the impossible, struck, and were gone before the question could be asked.